Easter, a time for fake grass, plastic eggs, these things, chocolate bunnies, and people dressed as bunnies. And then there are the weird parts of Easter, like fake grass, plastic eggs, these things, chocolate bunnies, and people dressed as bunnies, which is interesting. But what does all this stuff have to do with Easter? And if this holiday is about more than candy and wearing uncomfortable clothes to church and lunch with your relatives, what makes Easter happy?
Is there anyone here who actually likes Peeps? You know those little so-called marshmallow chicks and bunnies that show up every Easter? I might be the only one here, but those things don't bring me a lot of Easter happiness. I seriously gag at the sight of them, and the feeling of the texture of them is even worse. Despite my opinion, however, grocery stores load up on these with them all around Easter time. It's like a bunch of Peep-themed haunted houses. And what's crazy about this week after Easter is you see people rush to the store because they're half off. Seriously, what are you even going to do with all those Peeps after Easter? Every year around this time, I feel like I'm in a personal war against Peeps, especially because everyone around me loves them. Okay, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit. Peeps have never made me feel alone or on my own. But when I was a kid, I was always super tall. Whenever I was in class pictures, I was always towering above my classmates. So when I started to play midget football in elementary school, that presented me with a huge problem. Hold on, has anyone ever thought how kind of funny and mean the name midget football is? Right? Isn't that strange? Alright, anyway, since midget football was broken up by weight classes, I always was in the heavy class. So I was always playing with the grade above me. So I never got to hang out with my friends when I was in midget football. Thankfully, I was only 8 when this happened, so I adapted to the change pretty quickly. But there was definitely a feeling of loneliness that was there for a while. And that wasn't the only time I felt that way. Whether I was on my own making certain decisions, or standing by certain beliefs I believed in, or dealing with doubts or fears that I was feeling, that I felt like I was the only one who had them, I definitely had seasons of feeling alone. At this point in your life, I bet you have felt this way too. Maybe it's because your family has recently moved, or your friend group has changed, or maybe you've lost a friend, or you've had a breakup, or certain decisions that you feel like no one else understands. A question, a feeling, a doubt that you had, that you felt like no one understands you, especially your parents. I think we all know what it feels like to be on our own. And this is different than experiencing independence or freedom, isn't it? This on your own feeling is more of a feeling of fear, uncertainty, anxiety, all wrapped up into one. And when we feel like we are on our own, we start to believe things that seem true in the moment, but generally are not true. Maybe we think that no one understands us and probably never will, or that we'll never get through what we're facing, or that we don't have enough strength to make it on our own. Or maybe we've become more afraid and isolation only seems to intensify it. Here's what's so troubling about loneliness. Statistically speaking, almost half of Americans feel alone. Now, I have to admit, sometimes being alone is kind of cool. Like, I'm an introvert, half extrovert, so to spend some time alone for a long period of time, I can actually enjoy that and look forward to that. But there's a difference between feeling alone and being alone, right? Isn't there? Like, there's a difference between alone and lonely. And when it comes to loneliness, our generation is flooded with it. Why? Because loneliness makes us feel hopeless. Think about it this way. When we feel alone, we tend to feel overwhelmed. Overwhelmed by our situations, our circumstances, our feelings, our pain, our confusion. And here's what's crazy about that. Loneliness feels like it's bad to us because God has wired us that way. We were created and wired for close relationships. You and I were never meant to carry the weight of what we feel, experience, and worry about on our own. Well, believe it or not, what happened the very first Easter and the days following can be a game changer for us when it comes to seemingly overwhelming problems. The very first Easter left Jesus' closest friends feeling overwhelmed in a similar way. For years, they had been traveling together, doing life together, hanging out every day with Jesus. And suddenly, they were completely on their own. At least that's what they thought between the couple days between Jesus' death and his resurrection. And while we don't spend a lot of time during Easter thinking about the time between Jesus' death and his crucifixion and his resurrection, I can guarantee you that his closest friends and disciples and followers never forget how difficult those days felt. You see, Jesus' closest friends and followers had walked away from their jobs, their family members, their finances, and safety just to follow him. And when Jesus died, the future they imagined for their leader and their country and themselves had disappeared. Just like that, everything changed. So what did they do? Some stuck together, but many of them ran from their lives to hide from the people who killed Jesus. They had no clue what was going to happen next. We know how the story ends, but at the time, they didn't. So imagine how surprising the relief was to see Jesus alive again after he was resurrected. That is, until Jesus left again. Yes, you heard me right. Jesus died, came back to life, and then left again. But this time, their response was completely different, and here's how I know. One of the ways we know what happened with Jesus is by a document written down by this doctor named Luke, who was investigating the whole thing. Luke recorded exactly what happened with Jesus' followers after Jesus died and came back to life. It wasn't until after Jesus left a second time that Christianity really took off. It began to change human history forever. And it seems like Jesus made it this way on purpose. And we'll get to the rest of what Luke said later, but before we do that, I want to look at another document written by one of Jesus' good friends called John. John remembers that before Jesus was crucified, he told his disciples that he was going away, but they didn't get it at the time. This is where Jesus had his final meeting with his disciples before he was arrested. It says this, "But in fact, it was best for you that I go away." Jesus actually told his disciples that it would be better for them that he would leave. But why? Well, we're going to find out as Jesus continues. Jesus continues by saying this, "Because if I don't, the advocate won't come. If I do go away, I will send him to you." Jesus said in order for the advocate to come, he had to go. The term advocate usually refers to someone who helps, comforts, and defends others. And this is the same is true here. This advocate Jesus was referring to is what we call the Holy Spirit. It's basically the Spirit of God and Jesus among us, even though he's not physically present. He's the one who helps us, comforts us, gives us wisdom and power beyond ourselves. The Holy Spirit came to earth after Jesus left the earth. Jesus promised that if he would leave, it would be better for us. Why? Because the Holy Spirit would be there now. And once the Holy Spirit arrived, the power and the Spirit of Jesus could be everywhere, not just in Jesus. And so right before Jesus ascends into heaven and leaves for the second time, he reminds his disciples of what he said at the last meal together before he was killed. Yes, his physical body was leaving, but his spirit would remain behind. Check out what it says here in Acts 1:8. "But you will receive the power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. And you will be my witness, telling people about me everywhere in Jerusalem, throughout Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." Of all the things Jesus could have reminded his disciples of, he chose to remind them that the Holy Spirit was the way. The Holy Spirit would come and give them the power to tell people all over the world about him. In other words, it was a reminder that even though he was leaving, that they would not be alone. And guess what? It's exactly what happened. In the days and years that come, Jesus' followers will receive the power of the Holy Spirit to tell people all over the world about him. And today, roughly 1/3 of the Earth's population says they believe in that message. The Christian movement, started by Jesus and carried out by his first disciples, outlasted things like the powerful Roman Empire, intense persecution from governments and other religions, thousands of years of change. The men and women who Jesus left twice started the greatest movement in human history. Even when it seemed like their leader left, even when it was overwhelming the lack of resources they have, even when they perceived their powerlessness in the face of the government authorities of their day, the Holy Spirit gave them power even though they seemed powerless. And even though Jesus left, he sent the Holy Spirit to be with them. That meant that even though Jesus wasn't physically there, they would never be alone. And here's the best part about it all. Jesus' promise was not just for the first disciples. When Jesus promised an advocate who would be there and give us power within us, was true for everyone who would believe in him. That means you and I have access to that very same Spirit. as long as we believe in what Jesus did for us on the cross. See, Easter is so much bigger than a celebration of something that just happened 2,000 years ago. Yes, Jesus' resurrection changed everything, and the resurrection is the center of everything that we believe as followers of Jesus. But it's also a reminder of his power and his presence that's still available to us today. Easter can change everything about how we live our lives right now because this simple truth, that Easter means you're never alone. And in times like this, in isolation, we can feel alone. We must be reminded of this truth, that because of Easter, we're never alone. Jesus' first followers knew what it was like to feel like they were on their own. After he died, it seemed like all their hopes were crushed. And maybe they even felt like it was a mistake to follow Jesus. And while I can imagine they loved seeing him come back to life, they probably were surprised when he didn't stay with them. They probably were wondering why Jesus couldn't be with them physically. But as soon as they learned that he would leave something behind, actually he left someone behind, an advocate, the Holy Spirit, which they were reminded that they would never be alone. What if you and I could live with that same assurance and confidence? What if no matter how lonely or overwhelmed or misunderstood we feel, that we could trust that we are never alone? Let me ask it a little bit more directly. What if this is real? What if this is literal? Actual God who created everything and died and rose again is literally always with you. What if Jesus' Spirit is very real and he's here and he wants to help you with whatever you're facing today? See, simply trusting that the Holy Spirit is with us can change everything for us. In fact, even though we can't always see him and may not always feel like he's there, knowing he's with us in the moments we can feel like we're on our own, we can be confident in a couple things. That you can always talk to him anytime, any place, for any reason. When you feel alone, what if you chose to talk to God about something that you're going through? In the New Testament, we learn that the Holy Spirit helps us talk to God when we don't know what to say. What if the next time you felt like you were on your own, you chose to talk to God about what you were facing or what you were feeling? What would happen if you would chose to believe in him, that he hears you and that his Spirit can work in the ways that you can't even imagine or see? You're stronger than you think you are. The odds were stacked against Jesus' first followers. Like, Jesus wasn't there. They were underqualified. The Romans were incredibly powerful. Yet the movement that carried forward has forever changed the world. That's because they knew that they were stronger than they seemed. They knew that even though it looked like they were on their own, that they had God's power flowing through them in their lives. The same is true for you and I. When we face challenges that seem overwhelming for us, we can be confident that the Holy Spirit's power is in us and cannot be overcome. We can also be confident that God's power and other believers will be there to support us too. You might feel like what you're facing is too powerful for you, and that may be true, but it isn't too powerful for the one who is in you and in other Jesus followers around you. Remember, because of Easter, it means that you're never alone. The power of Easter is that Jesus enables us to be confident that we'll never be alone again. Why? Because we trust that his Spirit that lives inside of us, in a day and age where so many of us feel lonely, this might be the happiest news we've ever heard in a while. As we head into small groups on Zoom, I want to ask this question. In what area of your life do you feel alone? Then imagine that Jesus, the same Jesus who loves you, who died for you, is looking in your eyes and say, you are not on your own. We are in this together. Maybe the best news you'll hear this week is that you don't have to imagine this. The Holy Spirit makes it a reality. And that's why we say, Happy Easter.